I heard my husband's voice on the secret recording poison her. When she's dead, everything's mine." My sister laughed coldly beside him. My heart shattered. I'd slept next to a murderer for years without knowing. If you think this is just an ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now. The rain came down in cold, heavy sheets, slamming against the windshield like a relentless tide. The wipers moved back and forth in a rhythmic whisper, but the glass was still blurred with endless droplets, making the towering silhouette of the mansion beyond appear almost ghostly. Sarah sat motionless in the driver's seat, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The engine hummed softly beneath her, its vibrations crawling up her arms, but she felt nothing. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, locked onto the ornate iron gates in front of her. Gates now firmly chained shut from the inside. This was her home. Or at least it used to be. The grand estate she had lived in for the last 6 years, hosting glittering parties for her husband's business partners, decorating it with white orchids every spring, arranging books by color on the mahogany shelves to keep her mind calm during endless, lonely evenings. She could barely see it now through the rain, just flickers of warm golden light behind tall windows, curtains drawn tight. From this distance she imagined Daniel and Emily inside glasses clinking over crystal laughter echoing across marble floors. Her sister, her husband. Their silhouettes merged in betrayal behind her blurred vision like shadows dancing in flames. A tear rolled down her cheek, warm at first before the cold of the car's AC turned it to ice against her skin. She didn't even bother wiping it away. There was no point. She felt empty, hollow, like her soul had cracked wide open and the rain was pouring in, flooding her from the inside out. She closed her eyes just for a moment, letting her mind drift back to the beginning of this day, back to that moment when everything changed forever. That afternoon, the sun had been bright, flooding their modern glass-walled living room with sharp light. The air smelled faintly of fresh roses from the giant vase Emily had arranged on the marble table that morning. Sarah remembered thinking roses in winter. Only Emily would do that. Daniel stood by the wide floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the gardens. He was dressed impeccably in a dark tailored suit, his hair slicked back with meticulous precision. Even after years of marriage, Sarah still found him handsome. That old ache of loving him, of wanting him to be proud of her, still flickered in her chest despite everything. He didn't turn to look at her when she entered. His voice was low and controlled. "Sit down, Sarah. There's something we need to finalize today." She glanced at Emily, who was perched on the cream leather sofa with legs-crossed nails painted a deep crimson. Emily's eyes flicked over Sarah like she was inspecting something insignificant. A wrinkle in the drapes, a chipped tile on the floor. Then she offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. On the glass table lay a thick stack of papers neatly clipped together with a gold pen resting on top. Sarah's stomach tightened. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling more than she intended. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, trying to steady her breathing. Daniel finally turned. His blue eyes were cold flat, like winter ice. "It's the deed transfer for the property in Malibu," he said, "and the 2 condos in Manhattan, plus the stocks." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Why are you transferring them to me?" Emily let out a small chuckle, shaking her head as if Sarah had just told a naive joke. "Oh, sweet sister, he's transferring them to himself. You're signing them over." Sarah's eyes darted back to Daniel's face, searching for reassurance, a smile, a gentle correction. But there was nothing. Only that blank clinical gaze. "Daniel, I don't understand. Why would I sign everything over to you?" He walked towards her, each step measured his polished shoes silent against the marble floor. When he was close enough, he bent down slightly so they were eye to eye. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood and bergamot, and her stomach clenched with nausea. "Because I'm asking you to," he said softly, but there was no warmth in his tone. "Because it's the right thing to do. For the company. For us." "For us." Her voice cracked. "But we already co-own everything. Why do we need this?" Daniel's lips curled into a faint smile, though his eyes remained dead. "Because this way, it's cleaner. Less confusion for the board. Less legal hurdles when the merger is finalized next quarter." Emily shifted on the couch, adjusting her silk skirt and sighing dramatically. "Sarah, stop making this difficult. Just sign it. You don't want to slow down Daniel's work, do you? You know how important this is to him." Sarah looked at her sister, at the perfect hair, the flawless makeup, the expensive jewelry glittering at her throat and ears. For a moment something sharp and dangerous twisted inside her, but it died quickly under the crushing weight of confusion. She turned back to Daniel. Can I at least have our lawyer look over it first, just to—" Daniel's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. His fingers dug into her skin, cutting off her words mid-sentence. She gasped softly in pain. "I said sign it, Sarah," he hissed under his breath. "Don't embarrass me in front of Emily." The words sliced through her chest like glass. She looked at his hand on her wrist, at the veins standing out under his skin, at his knuckles white with pressure. This wasn't the man she fell in love with. Or maybe it was, and she was only seeing him clearly now without the comforting haze of her illusions. Her eyes welled up, tears threatening to spill, but she blinked them away. Trembling, she reached for the pen, and with a hand that barely obeyed her signed every page Daniel pointed to. Emily clapped her hands lightly when it was done. "Good girl," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked over to Daniel, placing her hand delicately on his shoulder. "Let's get dinner, darling," she purred. "You deserve to celebrate after such a productive day." Daniel didn't even glance at Sarah as he wrapped his arm around Emily's waist. The two of them walked out of the room, their laughter trailing behind like poison smoke. Sarah sat there alone, staring at her signature on each page, watching her name bleed into permanence. The roses on the table trembled in the breeze from the central air system petals falling one by one onto the white marble floor. Now, hours later, in the cold darkness of her parked car, Sarah watched as the last light in the mansion was turned off. Her mansion. The place where she once imagined raising children, celebrating anniversaries, growing old with Daniel. Her vision blurred with fresh tears as her chest heaved with silent sobs. The betrayal burned through her veins like acid, eating away at the last remnants of her hope. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, her nails cutting crescent moons into her palms. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the manicured gardens and the marble columns of the front porch for a split second before plunging everything back into darkness. In that flash of light she saw them, Daniel and Emily standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm glow of the entryway chandelier. Emily's hand rested on Daniel's chest as she tilted her head back, laughing at something he whispered into her ear. Then his hands slid around her waist, pulling her close. Their bodies pressed together in a dance that was far too intimate for a brother-in-law and sister-in-law. Sarah's stomach lurched. Her tears turned to ice. The thunder rumbled overhead long and deep, like the growl of an ancient god witnessing human cruelty. She started the car engine, the roar echoing in the silent driveway. Slowly she reversed her eyes, never leaving their entwined shadows in the doorway, until they disappeared behind the sheets of relentless rain. As she drove away from the mansion, from her marriage, her family, her life, she felt something inside her snap. Not break. Snap. Like a bowstring pulled too tight for too long, finally releasing its stored energy. The pain was still there. The betrayal still burned, but underneath, coiling in the darkness of her mind, something new was awakening, something cold, something sharp, something ready. And as the mansion vanished behind her into the stormy night, Sarah whispered to herself so quietly it was drowned out by the rain, "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just started." The rain was falling harder now, a steady, violent rhythm that drowned out the sound of her own ragged breathing. Sarah stood at the front door, soaked through her thin blouse, her hair plastered to her face in dripping tendrils. The cold bit into her skin, but she barely felt it. All she could hear was the echo of Daniel's voice from moments before, each word cutting into her like a blade. "Take her out," he'd said, his tone calm, almost bored, as if discussing the removal of an unsightly piece of furniture. 2 security guards, men she had known for years, men who used to greet her with polite nods and quiet good mornings. Mrs. Moore now stood in front of her like silent stone towers. Their eyes didn't meet hers. They didn't need to. Their orders were clear. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking with desperation. "Please, just let me talk to him." They didn't move. Behind them, through the tall glass doors of the foyer, she saw Daniel walking down the sweeping staircase, Emily by his side. Her sister's lips were curled into a small, satisfied smile, and her heels clicked against the marble floor with every graceful step. "Daniel," Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with pain as thunder rumbled above, shaking the ground under her feet. She pushed past the guards, slipping slightly on the wet stone steps, and stumbled into the doorway. The men grabbed her arms, but she fought them off with a strength born purely from anguish. "Daniel, please!" Her voice was hoarse now, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. "Why are you doing this? Talk to me. Tell me what I did wrong. I love you." He didn't even look at her at first. He paused to adjust the cuffs of his shirt beneath his suit jacket. The dark navy fabric, spotless and tailored to perfection. Then he glanced up, eyes meeting hers with the dead calm of a predator who had already won. "Don't make this messy, Sarah," he said, his voice flat and cold. "It's already done." Emily leaned into him, her manicured fingers tracing the lapel of his jacket, and for a moment her eyes met Sarah's. There was no pity there, only triumph. "Get her out," Daniel repeated, turning away. The guard's grips tightened around her arms, fingers like iron cuffs as they began to drag her backwards. Her feet scraped against the marble floor shoes, squeaking as she struggled to keep her balance. "Daniel," she screamed again, her voice raw, tearing at her throat. "Daniel, please. You can't do this to me. You can't." But he didn't turn around. He raised a hand in silent dismissal as he walked towards the door, Emily's arm now hooked securely in his. They moved in unison like a royal couple exiting a ballroom. As the guards forced her down the wide front steps, Sarah twisted in their hold, still straining to see him. Her chest was heaving, each breath burning with humiliation and heartbreak. The Rolls-Royce Phantom was waiting at the foot of the driveway, its polished black surface gleaming even under the assault of rain. One of Daniel's aides held an umbrella over his head as he descended the steps with Emily. The chauffeur opened the door with swift, robotic efficiency. Daniel, Sarah cried, her voice breaking into a sob that tore itself from deep within her chest. The guards let go of her at the bottom of the steps, but by then she could barely stand. She watched as he paused before getting into the car. For a brief second she thought, hoped, he might look back. That he might see her drenched and trembling, her hair dripping down her shoulders like drowning seaweed, her makeup smeared into dark bruises under her eyes. But he didn't. Instead, he placed his hand on Emily's lower back, guiding her into the back seat with the same gentle possessiveness he used to reserve only for Sarah. Then he followed, and the door closed behind him with a quiet final click. The car pulled away from the curb, its taillights glowing red through the haze of rain. Sarah staggered forward a few steps, arms reaching out towards the retreating vehicle as if she could drag it back with sheer willpower. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice gone stolen by the storm. She stood there for a long time watching the rolls disappear down the long, winding driveway until the red glow was swallowed by darkness. The guards moved back to their posts, silent and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. Lightning split the sky above, illuminating the driveway, the manicured gardens, and the massive stone lion statues guarding the entrance. Thunder crashed so violently that the ground trembled beneath her bare feet. She looked down and saw that one of her black suede heels had snapped clean at the stem, leaving her right foot pressed directly against the freezing wet stone. The broken shoe lay a few feet away, half submerged in a shallow puddle that rippled with each falling raindrop. Slowly, she bent down and removed the other shoe, her fingers numb and shaking. She held them in her hand for a moment, staring at the delicate straps and gold buckles she had once chosen so carefully to match her evening dress. Then she dropped them onto the steps, the splash of water echoing louder than she expected in the empty courtyard. She stepped forward, feeling the sting of the cold stone against her bare soles, feeling the grit and tiny sharp pebbles dig into her skin with every step. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her legs moved mechanically, driven by some primal instinct that told her she had to get away from there, from the guards, from the mansion, from everything that had been ripped away from her in the span of an afternoon. The iron gates loomed ahead, closed tightly. She reached them and wrapped her hands around the bars, pressing her forehead against the cold, wet metal. The rain was still coming down in torrents, soaking her, completely chilling her to the bone. She closed her eyes, and for a moment all she could hear was the rain, the distant rumble of thunder, and her own ragged breathing. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as the finality of what had just happened crashed over her. She was alone, utterly, completely alone, and for the first time in her life there was no one coming to save her. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she released the bars and turned away from the mansion. The gravel of the driveway bit into her bare feet as she walked each step, sending sharp jolts of pain up her legs. But she welcomed it. It grounded her in a reality that now felt too surreal to be true. She walked down the long, winding driveway towards the main road, the rain soaking her hair, her clothes dripping down her neck and into her shirt, sending chills across her skin. Her feet were bleeding now, tiny cuts forming where the sharp gravel pierced her soft soles. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. The pain was nothing compared to the void inside her chest. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing in the stormy darkness. A car drove past on the road beyond the gates, its headlights flashing across her for a brief moment before it continued on, leaving her in darkness once more. As she reached the end of the driveway, she paused. The iron gates towered over her, locked shut, unyielding. She could barely see the road beyond through the sheets of rain, but she knew she had to get there. She had to keep moving. Standing still felt like dying. She climbed awkwardly onto the stone ledge beside the gate, her wet feet slipping against the slick, moss-covered surface. She grabbed the wrought iron bars, pulling herself up inch by inch, her muscles straining with the effort. When she reached the top, she swung one leg over, scraping her shin against the rough metal. The pain was sharp, but she barely registered it. She landed hard on the other side, her knees buckling beneath her, sending her sprawling onto the cold, wet asphalt of the deserted road. She lay there for a moment, the rain pounding against her back, mixing with the blood from her scraped knees, and shin flowing down her legs in thin red rivulets. Slowly, she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, then to her feet. She stood there swaying slightly, her breath coming in harsh, uneven gasps. Around her, the world was silent, except for the relentless drumbeat of the rain. The mansion behind her was nothing more than a shadow in the darkness now, its lights hidden behind the tall stone walls and iron gates. She took a step forward, her bare feet slapping against the wet road, then another, and another. Each step sent a new wave of pain shooting up her legs, but she welcomed it. She clung to it, because it was real, because it was hers. And as she walked barefoot into the storm, her hair whipping around her face, her blood mingling with the rain, a single thought burned bright in the darkness of her mind. This isn't the end. Not yet. The night had turned bitter cold. The rain fell in thin, icy spears slicing down from the black sky as if the heavens themselves were punishing her. Sarah kept her head down each step forward, driven by sheer instinct rather than conscious thought. The road stretched out before her like an endless river of dark glass, broken only by scattered streetlights flickering with dying light. Her bare feet slapped against wet asphalt, numb with cold and pain. Every few steps she would stumble over a rock or a piece of broken branch, feeling the sharp stab slice into her skin, but she kept walking. One foot in front of the other, again and again. And the mansion was far behind her now, swallowed by darkness and distance, and with each step away from it, she felt both emptier and strangely lighter, as if each meter put between her and Daniel stripped away another layer of the illusions she'd lived under for so long. She didn't know where she was going until the memories pulled her in a direction her mind hadn't consciously chosen. After nearly an hour of walking, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her hair soaked and clinging to her cheeks, she saw it through the darkness, the small turnoff from the main road overgrown with weeds and half hidden behind a rusted old street sign. The driveway curved off into the shadows lined with trees, whose branches were now bent under the weight of the rain, forming an archway above the narrow gravel path. She turned onto it without hesitation. The gravel was rough and uneven under her raw feet, but she didn't stop. She walked breath-ragged in her chest, arms wrapped around herself as the cold seeped deep into her bones. The tall grass brushed against her ankles, slick with rain. The scent of wet pine needles and earth rose around her with every step, wrapping her in a familiarity she hadn't felt in years. And then finally she saw it, the old cabin. The small wooden house sat in the clearing like a forgotten relic of another time, its cedar shingles dark with age, windows boarded up to keep out storms, the front porch sagging slightly under decades of neglect. Yet even in the darkness, it felt warmer than the mansion had ever felt. More honest, more real. Sarah stood there for a moment, the rain falling in relentless sheets around her, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She didn't have the strength to release yet. Her vision blurred with tears and exhaustion as she climbed the creaking steps to the front door. The key was still hidden under the flower pot, exactly where it had been since she was a little girl. Her fingers fumbled numb and trembling as she fitted into the lock and twisted. The door groaned open, the scent of cedar and old paper and dust washing over her like a forgotten lullaby. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. For a moment, she just stood there, leaning back against the door, her chest heaving, eyes squeezed shut. And then the memories rushed back, crashing over her like the relentless waves of a rising tide. She was 8 years old again, curled up on the faded tartan couch by the fireplace. Outside, the first snow of winter was falling, the flakes swirling past the window in silent, graceful chaos. Inside, it was warm and golden. The old lamp on the desk cast a pool of soft yellow light onto the worn wooden floor. The scent of cinnamon tea steeping on the stove mixed with the sharp tang of the pine logs burning in the fireplace. Her grandfather sat at his workbench in the corner, hunched over the small, intricate gears of an antique pocket watch. His thick white hair glowed like a silver halo under the lamp. His hands, veined and strong, moved with slow precision, guided by patience honed through decades of meticulous craft. "Come here, little bird," he called softly without looking up. She slid off the couch, her wool socks whispering across the floor, and padded over to him. He lifted his eyes to her and smiled, the corners of his blue eyes crinkling like paper folds. "Do you hear that?" he asked, tilting his ear towards the tiny ticking watch. Sarah tilted her head, listening carefully. She heard the quiet, rhythmic beat of the watch's heart, steady and sure like a whisper from another time. "It's beautiful," she said. Her grandfather nodded. "This watch is over 100 years old. It has seen wars, love stories, betrayals, forgiveness, death, and life reborn. But it still ticks, because its gears are true. Its pieces fit together with absolute honesty and precision." He set down his tools and turned to her, fully resting a broad, warm hand on her small shoulder. "Remember this little bird?" he said, his voice deep and gentle. "In life you will meet people who look shiny and flawless on the outside, but inside their gears are rusted and broken. What matters is not what shines. What matters is what ticks true." She didn't fully understand then. She only nodded, comforted by the warmth in his gaze, by the scent of cedar smoke clinging to his flannel shirt, by the sense of safety that wrapped around her like his old knitted blankets. "Someday," he continued, lifting the pocket watch into the light, "you will need to decide who is true and who is only shiny. Don't choose what blinds you. Choose what ticks with honesty." Sarah sank down to the floor in the middle of the room, her body giving out beneath the weight of memory and grief. Her knees hit the rough wooden boards with a muted thud, but she didn't care. She folded forward, pressing her forehead to the floor, her hair falling around her like a wet curtain. The tears came then, violent and unstoppable. They tore themselves from her chest with ragged, guttural sobs, her shoulders shaking so hard it felt like her bones might shatter. Her cries mingled with the sound of rain hammering against the roof, each drop a sharp percussion that filled the silent, empty cabin with noise and life. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice cracking under the force of her grief. "I'm so sorry. I didn't listen. I didn't see. I thought they were true." She curled into herself, her bare feet tucked beneath her thighs, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, as if trying to hold the broken pieces together. Outside, lightning split the sky again, illuminating the small cabin through the gaps in the boarded windows, casting flickering shadows of the old furniture against the walls like ghosts dancing in the storm. She remembered sitting here beside him at night, watching him polish his watches, listening to the quiet tick-tick-tick of 100 tiny hearts all beating in their secret rhythms. She remembered the way he used to tuck her in on the old cot by the fireplace, brushing his rough, work-worn hand across her forehead as he whispered good night. "You are strong, little bird," he would say, "stronger than you think, and someday the world will need that strength." Her sobs softened into quiet whimpers, as exhaustion dragged at her limbs heavy and cold. She pressed her cheek to the floorboards, the wood dampening under the warmth of her tears. In the darkness of the cabin, in the quiet roar of the rain outside, she felt the faint echo of her grandfather's voice in her memory, steady and unbreakable. "Choose what ticks true." She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of that memory wrap around her like one of his old flannel blankets. For the first time since Daniel closed the door on her, she felt a flicker of something deep within her chest. Not hope. Not yet. But something like it. A tiny spark. A breath of embers waiting to catch. And as the storm raged on outside, Sarah lay curled on the wooden floor of her grandfather's cabin, letting the rain drown her sobs as she drifted into a sleep too heavy to fight. Her dreams filled with the quiet ticking of old pocket watches and the golden glow of love that could never be taken away. Morning came slowly, slipping through the cracks of the boarded windows in thin ribbons of gray light. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the occasional drip of water sliding off the eaves outside. Sarah woke curled on the wooden floor, her body stiff with cold and her muscles aching from the night before. She pushed herself up to sit, wincing as pain shot through her knees and hips. The cabin was silent around her, filled with the smell of old cedar and damp earth, the scent of a place that had been sealed away from life for too long. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around them. Her hair fell forward, shielding her face from the empty room. For a long moment she sat there, listening to her own heartbeat echo in her chest. Slow, heavy, tired. She felt like she could still hear her grandfather's voice whispering in the silence. Choose what ticks true. But what was true anymore? Everything she had believed in had shattered beneath her feet. Shivering, she forced herself to stand. Her feet screamed in pain as she put weight on them, the cuts and bruises from last night's walk flaring hot with each step. She limped towards the old oak wardrobe against the far wall, needing something warm, something dry. Anything to keep the cold from sinking deeper into her bones. The wardrobe creaked as she pulled it open. Inside, a few moth-eaten coats hung limply on rusted wire hangers, their shoulders sagging with age. She pushed them aside and reached for the shelf above, feeling around in the dark for the thick wool blanket she remembered her grandfather keeping there. Her fingers brushed against something hard. She paused, frowning. Shifting aside a folded tartan quilt, she found a small wooden box tucked into the corner. It was heavy in her hand, about the size of a thick novel. The surface was dark with age, carved with intricate patterns of twisting vines and tiny flowers that wound around the lid and down each side. In the center was a small, inlaid sapphire so deep and blue it seemed to hold the ocean within its facets. Sarah held her breath as her fingers traced the carvings, feeling the familiar ridges and grooves under her skin. She remembered this box. Her grandfather used to keep it on the high shelf in his bedroom closet, far out of reach of curious little hands. She had only seen it once when she was 5, and he had scolded her gently for trying to climb up to get it. "That's not for you yet, little bird," he had said, lifting her down from the chair she'd dragged across the room. "Someday, when the time is right." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she carried the box to the low table near the window. The wood was cold against her palms, and for a moment she hesitated. She felt like a child again, caught with something forbidden. But there was no one left to tell her no. With trembling fingers she lifted the latch. The lid opened with a quiet creak, releasing a faint scent of cedar and lavender oil. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded red velvet, was a ring. It was breathtaking. A large sapphire cut in a deep oval, encased in an ornate setting of twisted silver and tiny diamonds. The stone gleamed even in the dim morning light, its surface reflecting flashes of indigo and teal with every small movement. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, all she could do was stare. The ring looked ancient, regal, like something out of a forgotten royal treasury. She reached out and lifted it carefully from its resting place, feeling its unexpected weight in her hand. Beneath where the ring had lain was a folded piece of yellowed paper. Her fingers shook as she picked it up, unfolding it with delicate care. The handwriting was instantly familiar, strong, precise strokes that curved slightly to the right. Her grandfather's hand. She read the words, her eyes blurring with tears before she forced herself to blink them away. "My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, it means life has pushed you to a place where truth matters more than comfort. This ring is older than you know and more powerful than it seems. Sell it to the right person and you will find the answers you seek. Do not trust appearances. Do not trust fear. Trust only what you feel deep in your bones to be true. Sell it to the right person, little bird. and you will finally know everything." Her hands fell to her lap, the letter trembling between her fingers. She read it again, and again. But the words did not change. "Sell it to the right person and you will find the answers you seek." What answers? She whispered into the silent cabin. Her voice sounded small and broken in the vast quiet. She looked down at the ring, its sapphire glinting up at her like an unblinking eye. It felt like it was staring into her soul, seeing all the cracks she had tried so hard to hide. She thought of Daniel's face as he turned away from her, of Emily's satisfied smile, of the cold echo of her grandfather's empty workbench, of the pocket watches that ticked true while human hearts lied and betrayed. She didn't understand. But somewhere deep within the numb exhaustion under the pain and the grief, something flickered. A tiny spark of heat in the frozen darkness. Hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was what he had meant when he told her she was stronger than she thought. Maybe this ring, this hidden secret, was the piece she needed to finally understand why her life had burned down around her, why everything she believed had turned to ash. Her thumb brushed over the sapphire, feeling the tiny imperfections on its polished surface, the minute ridges where it had been shaped by a craftsman's patient hands. For the first time in days, her breath came easier in her chest. The pain was still there. The fear still gnawed at the edges of her mind. But now they were joined by something else. Purpose. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box before closing the lid. The quiet click of the latch felt final, like the closing of a chapter she could never return to. She set the box aside and wrapped herself in the old wool blanket, the scratchy fabric scratching at her raw skin, but warming her all the same. Sitting on the floor with the ring in her palm, she lifted her gaze to the boarded window, watching as dawn finally began to break through the storm clouds beyond. She didn't know what answers the ring held, or what secrets would come spilling out when she found the right person. But she knew one thing for certain: she would find out, no matter what it cost. And for the first time since Daniel had called the guards to drag her out into the storm, Sarah felt her lips twitch with the smallest ghost of a smile. The world had taken everything from her, but it had left her this: a question, a key, a mystery. And she would find the truth, because her grandfather had taught her well. Choose what ticks true. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah reached the edge of Brooklyn. The streets still glistened with dampness, reflecting the pale gray of the morning sky, like shattered glass under her worn sneakers. Her feet burned with every step, raw and blistered from yesterday's barefoot walk, but she barely felt the pain. Her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memory of her grandfather's letter and the cold, heavy sapphire ring tucked securely in her pocket. She had left the cabin at dawn, locking it behind her with trembling hands. She didn't know when, or if, she would ever return. All she knew was that the answers she needed weren't hidden in that old house. They were hidden within the sapphire, and someone out there would know how to read its secrets. She had taken the subway into the city, sitting in the furthest corner of the train car, ignoring the curious glances of the early commuters. Her hair was still damp, her jeans stiff with dried rainwater and mud. She felt like a ghost among the living unseen, yet somehow more painfully visible than ever before. The sapphire weighed heavy against her leg as she stepped onto the sidewalk in Brooklyn Heights, her eyes scanning the old brownstone buildings until she found the one she was looking for: Morris & Sons, antique jewels and timepieces. The brass plaque by the door gleamed dully in the weak morning light, its edges worn with age. Sarah paused in front of the shop, gathering her breath. Her heart was hammering in her chest, each beat echoing with the same thought. What am I about to uncover? The bell above the door tinkled softly as she stepped inside. The smell of old wood-polish metal filings and faint lavender oil washed over her, instantly grounding her in a strange sense of déjà vu. The narrow shop was lined with glass display cases holding antique brooches, pocket watches and rings that glowed with faded grandeur. Dust motes floated in the golden light streaming from the small windows high above. At the back, hunched over a cluttered workbench, sat a man with thinning silver hair combed neatly back round glasses perched low on his nose. He wore a tweed vest over a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing thick, veined forearms marked by decades of delicate labor. A magnifying loop hung around his neck, swaying slightly as he tinkered with a small silver watch, its tiny gears exposed under his careful fingers. "Mr. Morris?" Sarah's voice sounded foreign in the quiet warmth of the shop. The old man looked up, blinking behind his glasses. His pale blue eyes were sharp and clear despite his age, glancing at her with polite curiosity before flicking back to the watch. "Yes, how can I help you?" His voice was rough but gentle, like gravel smoothed by years of river water. Sarah stepped forward, clutching the small velvet pouch in her pocket. Her palms were slick with sweat, despite the chill of the shop's air conditioning. She swallowed hard, feeling her throat tighten around her words. I need you to look at something for me," she said, pulling out the pouch and placing it carefully on the glass counter in front of him. Mr. Morris raised an eyebrow, his fingers stilling on the tiny gears of the watch. He set down his tools and turned to face her, fully wiping his hands on a faded linen cloth tucked into his belt. Gently, he untied the pouch and tipped the contents into his wrinkled palm. For a moment, the only sound in the shop was the quiet hum of the old ceiling fan overhead. He held the sapphire ring up to the light, rotating it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. The stone glowed under the hanging lamp, its deep blue depths catching flecks of gold and indigo in the reflection. "Beautiful piece," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he examined the intricate silver setting. "Where did you get this, if you don't mind me asking?" "It belonged to my grandfather," Sarah said softly, her gaze locked on the ring. "He left it for me before he died. But he left me a note. It said, 'Sell it to the right person, and you will know the truth.'" Mr. Morris frowned, glancing up at her through his glasses. "The truth?" She nodded, her hands twisting together in front of her. "I don't know what he meant, but I think this ring is hiding something important." The old man was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once briskly and turned to his workbench. "Come here." Sarah moved around the counter, careful not to bump the rows of hanging tools and delicate chains draped along the walls. Mr. Morris sat down on his high stool and switched on a bright LED lamp attached to the side of his magnifying rig. He gestured for her to stand beside him. With surprising dexterity, he flipped down his magnifying loop and positioned the sapphire under the small microscope attached to his bench. The monitor flickered to life, showing a magnified image of the stone's surface. At first, all she saw were tiny scratches and minuscule flecks of dust trapped in the setting. But as Mr. Morris adjusted the focus, his breath caught softly. "What is it?" Sarah whispered, leaning forward. He didn't answer immediately. His gloved fingers rotated the ring under the lens, shifting the angle until the sapphire's deep ocean blue became a glowing landscape of ridges and microscopic fractures. But there, near the base of the stone, almost invisible to the naked eye, was something else. Embedded within the sapphire was a tiny, perfectly squared chip. No larger than a grain of sand, it glowed faintly under the specialized light of his scope. What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Morris sat back slowly, removing his glasses. His eyes were wide behind his lined face, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. That he said finally, his voice tight with wonder and unease, "is a nano-spy chip. It's a highly sophisticated piece of technology, military grade, and it's been embedded seamlessly within the sapphire itself." Sarah's knees weakened, and she reached out to grip the edge of the workbench to keep herself upright. The world felt like it had tilted sideways beneath her feet. Spy chip," she whispered. He nodded, still staring at the sapphire on his screen. I've seen tracking chips embedded in metal settings before, but never something like this. Whoever designed this, they didn't just want to hide it. They wanted to protect it. Sapphire is one of the hardest natural materials on Earth. Embedding it inside would make it almost indestructible. Sarah's thoughts spun in dizzying circles. Her grandfather's words rang in her ears. Sell it to the right person and you will know the truth. Can you read it? She asked, her voice no more than a breath. Mr. Morris hesitated. Then he looked up at her, his eyes narrowed in concern. Miss, whoever hid this didn't intend for ordinary eyes to find it. I have a friend at NYU, a nanotech engineer. If anyone can extract and read this chip safely, it's him. But... He paused, glancing around the empty shop as if making sure they were alone. If what's on this chip is dangerous, are you prepared for what it might reveal? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her heart hammering in her chest like a warning drum. When she opened them again, her gaze was clear, cold, and unyielding. I don't care how dangerous it is, she whispered. I need to know the truth. And in that moment, under the harsh glow of the microscope lamp, as the sapphire glinted with hidden secrets, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Something that felt dangerously close to power. Because for the first time since Daniel had ripped her world apart, she wasn't just a woman abandoned in the rain. She was a woman with a secret, and secrets had power. The walls of Morris's shop felt as though they were closing in around Sarah, their faded floral wallpaper and shelves of antique silverware suffocating her with silence. She watched as Mr. Morris delicately removed the sapphire from under the microscope and placed it on a black velvet pad, his gnarled fingers surprisingly steady despite what they had just discovered. He reached beneath his workbench, pulling out a slim metallic box lined with cables and blinking lights. Sarah could barely breathe as he connected the tiny extracted chip to a micro-reader the size of a thumb drive, which he then plugged into his old Lenovo laptop. The screen flickered to life with lines of indecipherable code scrolling down in green. The room seemed to hum with electric tension. I don't know what we'll find here, Mr. Morris muttered, his eyes narrowing behind his bifocals as he typed with quick practice strokes. But whatever it is, your grandfather went to unimaginable lengths to protect it. Sarah nodded numbly, her throat too tight to speak. Her fingers dug into the edge of the workbench as she leaned closer, needing to see everything. Her pulse thundered in her ears so loudly it almost drowned out the whir of the laptop fan. Then with a final keystroke, the code froze. A single file icon appeared on the desktop labeled in stark black letters, Final Testament. Mr. Morris swallowed visibly, glancing at her with a silent question. Sarah felt her legs shaking beneath her. The air felt thick and electric, pressing down on her chest. But her voice was clear when she whispered, "Play it." Mr. Morris clicked the icon. For a brief second, the speakers crackled with static. Then a voice emerged, clear and unmistakable. "Is this recording?" It was Daniel. His voice was slightly distorted, as though filtered through hidden microphones, but the confident arrogance threading each word was undeniable. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. Another voice answered him with a sharp impatience. "Yes, it's recording. Hurry up." Sarah flinched. Emily. Her own sister. The sister who once braided her hair before school, who cried in her arms the night their father died. Hearing her voice now felt like knives scraping across Sarah's ribs. Daniel let out a short laugh, humorless and cold. "Fine. Listen carefully. We keep the dosage low, just enough to weaken him slowly. He's old. No one will suspect a thing if he falls sick gradually." Her vision swam. For a moment she couldn't process the words. Her mind tried to reject them, to push them away as impossible. "They're talking about—" No, they couldn't. Emily's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, sharp and dripping with scorn. "And the will. You said he'd already signed everything over. He has, Daniel replied, his tone oozing satisfaction. The old man trusted me completely. He wanted to make sure his daughter, Sarah, would be taken care of. The fool signed over power of attorney to me months ago. The final dechuk just needs his signature, then it's done. Once the assets are transferred, we finish it, quickly. There was a pause. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth to stop the sob threatening to escape. Her lungs burned with silent screams she couldn't release, and Sarah Emily's voice asked. Sarah heard it tremble with something she couldn't place, fear, eagerness, or disgust. Daniel chuckled. Don't worry about her. Once the money is locked down, I'll make sure she's handled. She's too naive to fight back anyway. Emily snorted. God, you'd better. I can't keep pretending to be her sweet little sister. Every time she looks at me with those trusting eyes, I want to gag. Just thinking about how pathetic she is makes me sick. A scraping sound echoed through the speakers, a chair being pushed back. Daniel's voice moved closer to the mic, lowering into a conspiratorial whisper. You've played your part perfectly, baby. Just a little longer. Soon all of this will be behind us. Then the recording ended in a burst of static. The shop fell into silence so heavy it felt physical. Sarah realized she hadn't taken a breath in nearly a minute. Her chest spasmed as air rushed back into her lungs, making her shoulders jerk violently. Her vision blurred with tears she couldn't blink away. Her hands trembled so hard the edges of the workbench rattled under her grip. For a long moment she just stood there staring at the blank laptop screen, seeing nothing but darkness. Mr. Morris's voice was gentle, hesitant, as if he feared he might break her completely if he spoke too loudly. I'm so sorry you had to hear that. Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. Inside her chest, her heart felt like it was splitting open. Pain, betrayal, horror. They all clawed up through her ribs, fighting to escape her throat. She remembered Emily holding her hand at their father's funeral, whispering, "At least we still have each other." She remembered Daniel kissing her forehead after her grandfather's burial, murmuring, "I'll protect you now, Sarah." Lies, all of it, poisonous, rotting lies. She squeezed her eyes shut, and for a moment she saw her grandfather's face, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling with his smile, the scent of his cedar aftershave, his strong arms lifting her onto his shoulders so she could touch the ceiling beams of the cabin, giggling with fearless joy. Choose what ticks true. She inhaled shakily, tasting salt on her lips. When she opened her eyes, they burned with something fierce and dangerous. The helplessness that had wrapped around her like chains for days began to crack and splinter under a rising heat in her chest. How? Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. How do I save this file? Mr. Morris blinked. I can transfer it onto a flash drive. But miss, if you're thinking of confronting them, you must be careful. People like this, they won't hesitate to. I'm not confronting them. Sarah cut him off, her tone eerily calm. She wiped her tear-streaked face with the back of her sleeve. Her hands still shook, but her voice was steady. I'm going to expose them, but I need to do it right. Mr. Morris nodded solemnly. I'll transfer it now. As he worked silently, Sarah leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the shelves lined with antique clocks and pocket watches. Their quiet ticking filled the shop with a rhythmic chorus, like dozens of tiny hearts beating as one. For the first time since Daniel threw her out into the rain, she didn't feel like she was drowning. Beneath the grief and rage, something colder and stronger began to settle in her bones. Resolve. She had spent her entire life being careful, being kind, making herself small so others could shine. But this was beyond forgiveness. They had stolen her family, her home, her future. They had used her love as a weapon against her. and now she finally saw them for what they were: predators. When Mr. Morris handed her the flash drive, his wrinkled fingers brushing hers, she felt something shift inside her. She clenched her fist around the tiny piece of plastic, feeling its sharp edges bite into her palm like a promise. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice ragged but firm. "You've done more for me than you know." He looked at her with quiet sadness. "Be careful, miss. The world you're stepping into now, it's darker than you can imagine." Sarah nodded slowly, slipping the flash drive into her coat pocket. As she walked out into the morning light, her steps felt heavier, but her gaze was clear. She didn't care how dark it was. She had spent her whole life in the shadows of others. It was time to become her own light. The bell above the shop door jingled softly as Sarah stumbled out onto the cracked Brooklyn sidewalk. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the street, but she barely noticed the light. Her vision blurred with tears she couldn't hold back any longer. She pressed her hand against the cool glass window of Morris & Sons, her knees buckling under the crushing weight in her chest. The world tilted and spun around her as grief and rage collided with each other in a violent storm. Her stomach twisted so painfully she thought she might be sick right there on the sidewalk. She sank down onto the stone step in front of the shop, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. The air smelled faintly of bagels from the deli across the street, of car exhaust, of old rain rising in steam from the pavement. For a moment, none of it felt real. It was as if she had stepped out of her life and into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She buried her face in her hands, her hair falling forward like a curtain around her. A silent scream tore through her chest, ripping her apart from the inside out. Tears spilled through her fingers, hot and endless, soaking the sleeves of her jacket. Her ribs convulsed with silent sobs until her entire body trembled with the force of them. Images flashed through her mind in rapid, savage succession. Daniel's smile the day he proposed, his hand warm on hers as he slipped the diamond ring onto her finger, promising her a life of safety and love. Emily braiding her hair before her wedding, whispering, "You're going to be the most beautiful bride, Sarah. I'm so proud of you." Lies, all of it. The memory twisted and blackened, the words from the recording overlaying the memories like poison dripping onto flowers. Just a little longer. She's too naive to fight back anyway. I can't keep pretending to be her sweet little sister. Her fingernails dug into her scalp, pain shooting across her skull, but it wasn't enough to drown out the agony inside her chest. She wanted to scream until her throat tore open. She wanted to tear at her skin until the pain inside her had somewhere to escape, but she couldn't. She could only sit there, curled up on the cold stone step, sobbing into her hands as the world moved on around her. Strangers passed by without stopping, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. A woman pushing a stroller glanced at her with pity before hurrying on. A teenage boy waiting for the bus watched her for a moment before turning away, slipping his headphones back into his ears. No one knew that a woman's entire world had just been burned to ash. The glass door behind her opened with a quiet click, and Mr. Morris stepped out. He crouched down beside her, his old knees cracking softly, and placed a gentle, heavy hand on her trembling shoulder. "Child," he said softly, his voice rough with age but strong with purpose. "I know this pain. I have seen it before. Betrayal, it cuts deeper than any knife." Then Sarah couldn't look at him. Her tears dripped onto the concrete between her shoes, each drop a silent testament to the shattering of her trust, her hope, her life as she knew it. I can't breathe," she gasped out between sobs, pressing her fist to her chest. It hurts so much, I can't." Mr. Morris squeezed her shoulder gently. "I know it does. But you must breathe, Sarah. You must. Because this pain is only the beginning. There is more to come. And if you let it break you now, they will win. Do you hear me? They will win." She shook her head violently, her hair whipping across her face. "I don't care. Let them win. I can't do this. I don't want to fight them. I just want to go back. To before I knew." Her voice cracked and disappeared into the cold morning air. Mr. Morris sighed deeply, the sound echoing with a lifetime of weary wisdom. He shifted, crouching until his lined, weathered face was level with hers. His pale blue eyes burned with an intensity that forced her to look up at him. "Listen to me, child," he said, his voice low and vibrating with quiet power. "There is no going back. Not for you. Not after what you have heard. Not after what you know. Going back would not erase their betrayal. It would only erase you." Sarah blinked at him, her tears pooling in her lashes, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't know how to fight people like them." Mr. Morris nodded slowly. "That is what they count on. That is why they chose you. Because you are kind. Because you are gentle. Because you have spent your life making yourself smaller so others could shine." He reached out and gently took her trembling hand in his. His grip was warm and solid, grounding her in a way that felt like standing on bedrock after drifting in an endless ocean. "But listen to me now, Sarah." His eyes bored into hers with an unflinching force that made her chest tighten painfully. "You are not weak. You are not small. You are a mountain they mistook for a pebble. And it is time. It is time you showed them the truth." She shook her head again, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. How can I? I'm just me." Mr. Morris smiled softly, sadness and pride mingling in the deep lines around his mouth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the sapphire ring, holding it up between them. The morning sun caught the stone, making it glow like captured ocean light. "You are not just anything, child. You are the granddaughter of a man who saw the darkness of this world and chose to fight it. You carry his blood, his wisdom, his strength. And you carry this." He pressed the ring into her palm, closing her fingers tightly around it. The metal was cold against her skin, but the stone burned with an inner fire. "This ring is not just a memory," he said softly. "It is your weapon, your shield, your truth. Do not let it become your regret." Sarah stared down at the sapphire in her clenched fist. For a long moment, all she saw was her reflection warped in the dark blue depths. Her tear-streaked face, her red-rimmed eyes, her trembling lips. But then she saw something else. A flicker of something fierce, something unbreakable, something hers. She sucked in a ragged breath, her chest heaving as fresh oxygen flooded her starving lungs. Her tears still fell, but they were quieter now, rolling down her cheeks in silent streams. She tightened her grip around the sapphire, feeling its edges bite into her skin. Her heart still ached with a grief so deep it felt bottomless. But beneath the grief, something else began to glow. Something hard and sharp and impossibly bright. Resolve. She raised her head slowly, meeting Mr. Morris's gaze with eyes that no longer held only despair. A new fire burned in their depths, fueled by betrayal and sharpened by purpose. What do I do now?" she whispered. Mr. Morris squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening faintly with unshed tears. "Now, child. Now you stand up." He helped her to her feet, his old bones creaking in protest. She swayed slightly, her legs trembling under her, but she did not fall. She slipped the sapphire ring into her pocket, feeling its weight settle against her thigh like a promise. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, smearing tears across her skin, but not caring. Her gaze turned toward the end of the street where the city loomed tall and indifferent beyond the rooftops. For the first time since Daniel had thrown her out into the rain, Sarah felt something bloom in her chest. It was not hope. Not yet. It was something fiercer. Determination. She turned back to Mr. Morris, her voice low but steady. "Thank you," she said softly. He smiled, his eyes crinkling with sadness and quiet pride. "Go, child. Go do what you were born to do." Sarah nodded, squaring her shoulders against the morning chill. She took one last deep breath, tasting the salt of her tears and the bitter copper of her rage. Then she turned and walked down the street, her steps small but unyielding, her shadow stretching long behind her in the rising sun. And in her pocket, the sapphire burned with silent promise. The next morning, Sarah sat at a corner table in a deserted diner on 43rd Street, staring at the mug of untouched coffee in front of her. Her reflection trembled in the black liquid, pale skin, shadowed eyes, chapped lips pressed together so hard they'd turned white. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. The sapphire ring lay heavy in her coat pocket, burning against her thigh like an ember refusing to die. All night she had lain awake in the cabin, listening to the rain drum against the tin roof, feeling the cold seep into her bones as she played the recording over and over in her mind. Just a little longer. She's too naive to fight back anyway. Each time she heard Emily's voice, sharp with disgust, dripping with betrayal, another thread inside her chest snapped until there was nothing left to hold her together but rage. And now in the dim neon glow of the diner at 6:12 a.m., she finally made her choice. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. The cracked screen lit up with its familiar constellation of scratches. She scrolled past the dozens of missed calls from Daniel, calls she knew were not born of worry, but control. Past the single text from Emily. "Let's talk. You're overreacting." Her thumb hovered over the keypad as her chest tightened. Then she drew in a long, shaking breath and typed in the number from the old emergency contact card her grandfather once gave her. "If you ever find yourself in danger that no one else can protect you from, call this number. Say your name, and say my name." Her grandfather had never explained. She never asked. It was just one of his many quiet eccentricities. Another harmless story of his mysterious past. But now, holding the ring, he left her, hearing his voice in every tick of the diner's wall clock. She realized nothing about her grandfather had ever been harmless. She pressed the call button. It rang only once. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterintelligence Division. A clipped female voice answered. "State your business." Sarah swallowed her throat so dry it burned. Her voice came out cracked and ragged. "My name is Sarah Whitmore. I have evidence of espionage, corporate murder plots, and financial fraud tied to multiple offshore accounts." Silence crackled through the line like static. Then, "Who referred you to this line, Ms. Whitmore?" She gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles whitened. "Peter Whitmore. My grandfather." The pause was longer this time, heavy with unspoken understanding. "Please hold." She waited, staring out the window at the empty street, her heartbeat echoing in her skull. Within minutes, the line clicked again. "This is Special Agent Cole," a male voice said. His tone was calm, measured deep, the kind of voice that could command a room without ever rising in volume. "Ms. Whitmore, where are you right now?" she told him. Her voice shook with each syllable. "Stay there," he ordered. "Do not speak to anyone. Do not leave. I will be there in 15 minutes. The call ended abruptly, leaving only the faint hum of the diner's refrigerator and the hiss of the old coffee machine behind the counter. Sarah set down her phone, her hands trembling so hard she almost knocked over her mug. 15 minutes later, the door swung open with a dull chime. A tall man entered, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that seemed to absorb the weak morning light. He moved with an unhurried confidence, scanning the diner until his gaze landed on her. Agent Cole looked around 40, with hair dark enough to appear black in the diner's flickering fluorescent glow, streaked faintly with steel gray at his temples. His eyes were pale hazel, almost golden, and startlingly clear against the firm lines of his face. He walked over and sat across from her, without a word, pulling out a leather identification wallet and flipping it open for her to see. FBI, counterintelligence. Ms. Whitmore, he said quietly, sliding the ID back into his inner coat pocket in one smooth motion. I'm Special Agent Cole. You called about evidence regarding corporate espionage and murder plots. His voice carried no judgment, no disbelief, only focus. Sarah swallowed, fighting the tears threatening to choke her words. Yes, she whispered. She fumbled in her coat pocket, pulling out the sapphire ring and the flash drive Mr. Morris had given her. She laid them carefully on the table between them. It's all here. The chip. It has recordings. Of my husband. And my sister. Planning my father's death. Planning everything. Agent Cole studied her for a long moment, his sharp hazel eyes scanning every twitch of her trembling fingers, every flicker of anguish across her face. Then he picked up the ring with surprising gentleness, turning it in his gloved hand to examine the sapphire under the diner's dim yellow light. Your grandfather, Peter Whitmore. He told you to call this number. Sarah nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her shaking hand. I didn't know who he really was. He left this ring, he said. Sell it to the right person and you'll know the truth. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Agent Cole's mouth, though his eyes remained hard and calculating. Your grandfather was a good man, he said softly. I worked with him, a long time ago. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. She looked at the agent through her tears, searching his face for any hint of deceit. But all she saw was a sadness so deep it seemed carved into his bones. Ms. Whitmore. He continued, firmly leaning forward until his folded hands nearly touched hers on the scratched Formica table. I'm going to need you to come with me to the field office. We need to document everything you have. Your statement, the chip, any knowledge you can provide about your husband's accounts and connections. I promise you, we will protect you. Absolutely. Sarah stared down at the sapphire between them. The gem caught the neon glow from the diner sign outside, flickering with blue fire. Her chest tightened with a sudden, desperate grief. She had spent her whole life trusting the wrong people, loving those who saw her as nothing but a pawn. Now a stranger in a gray suit was promising her safety, and for the first time in days, she almost believed it. She looked up and met Agent Cole's gaze. His eyes held hers without blinking, calm and unwavering. She saw no cruelty in them, no disgust, no betrayal. Only a silent promise she wasn't sure she could afford to trust. But she would, because she had nothing left to lose. She nodded. Agent Cole stood and slipped the sapphire and flash drive into an evidence pouch, tucking it carefully into his jacket. He extended his hand toward her palm up. A simple gesture, an invitation, a choice. Sarah stared at it for a moment, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then she slipped her trembling hand into his. His grip was firm, warm, anchoring her to the ground before she drifted away again. As they walked out of the diner into the pale dawn light, she felt a small spark ignite in her chest, a flicker of something that might one day become hope. But for now, it was enough that she felt the first quiet threads of safety beginning to weave around her shattered heart. Sarah sat in a sterile white room on the 30th floor of the Hudson Crest Hotel, staring at the bank of monitors lining the far wall. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon disinfectant. The hum of electronics vibrated through the cold tile floor, merging with the pounding of her pulse in her ears. Agent Cole stood to her left, arms crossed over his broad chest, His eyes locked on the screens with quiet intensity, a tactical communications headset curled around his ear, its black mic hovering near his stubbled jawline. Target 1 is exiting the town car. A voice crackled from the speakers overhead. Black suit, no tie briefcase. Target 2 is following. White dress, sunglasses, carrying a Louis Vuitton duffel. Sarah's throat went dry. On the screen, Daniel emerged from a black Mercedes parked outside a sleek granite bank tower downtown. He looked calm, elegant, untouchable in his tailored Armani suit. His dark hair was combed back perfectly. Even through the camera feed, his aura of dominance radiated like a silent storm. Emily stepped out after him, her long platinum hair falling over one shoulder like a waterfall of molten silver. She wore an ivory sheath dress that clung to her figure like second skin. On the surface, she looked every bit the pampered socialite, but Sarah saw it now. The steel beneath the silk, the viper curled beneath the roses. She felt bile rise in her throat. "Are you sure they're transferring the money today?" She whispered, her voice so quiet it was barely audible above the hum of servers lining the far wall. Agent Cole glanced down at her, his golden brown eyes unreadable. Intelligence intercepted an encrypted call between Daniel and a Swiss banker last night. They're moving $50 million to a numbered account in Zurich this morning. Sarah's head spun. $50 million. She remembered the day she met Daniel at the nonprofit gala, how impressed she'd been by his humble beginnings story. How he'd told her he worked tirelessly to build a future for us, a future of stability and security, a future that never included her at all. She clutched the paper cup of stale coffee between her hands so tightly it buckled inward, hot liquid sloshing over her trembling fingers. She didn't even feel the burn. On the screens, Daniel and Emily entered the bank lobby, security guards bowing slightly as they passed. Another camera feed flickered on inside the elevator. Daniel's profile was sharp and stoic, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed ahead with lethal focus. Emily turned toward him, her ruby lips curling into a smile. She slipped her hand inside his arm, leaning up to whisper something in his ear. Daniel smirked. Sarah's vision blurred. A pulse of rage lit behind her sternum, hot and blinding. She wanted to scream at them through the screens. She wanted to rip the monitors from the wall and smash them to pieces, but her body wouldn't move. It was as if she were bolted to the chair, her fury shackled by the iron bars of grief still caging her chest. "They're approaching the private banking floor," the agent at the console reported calmly. Team Bravo confirm eyes on. A small window on the monitor flickered to life, showing 2 FBI tactical officers in plain clothes sitting at a glossy mahogany conference table, pretending to examine a mortgage contract. One of them, a woman with short black hair and steel-gray eyes, tapped twice on her pen to signal readiness. "Target 1 and 2. Entering the conference suite," she said softly into her concealed mic. Briefcase is chained to Target 1's wrist. Target 2 is placing duffel on the table. Sarah clenched her shaking hands in her lap, her fingernails biting into her palms until she felt hot pain bloom under each crescent mark. She couldn't look away. The camera zoomed in on the duffel bag as Emily unzipped it with elegant, perfectly manicured fingers. Stacks of bound $100 bills appeared row upon row, bundled in red security tape stamped with the Federal Reserve seal. Sarah counted 3 rows before her stomach twisted with nausea. "That's how much my father's life was worth to them," she whispered, tasting acid at the back of her throat. $50 million. Agent Cole said nothing, but his gaze flickered toward her, the muscle in his jaw tightening for half a second before he returned his focus to the monitors. "Wire transfer in progress," the female operative's voice came through. "Target 1 is inputting authorization codes." Another feed showed a Swiss banker's face on a laptop screen. He spoke in clipped, German-accented English, reading off security confirmations. Daniel nodded, typing with swift precision. Sarah's heartbeat pounded louder and louder in her ears. She felt lightheaded, her body trembling with the force of terror and adrenaline coursing through her blood. "Do they know?" she rasped, unable to finish the sentence. Her vocal cords felt shredded. Agent Cole shook his head once. "They have no idea. You're safe, Ms. Whitmore. We've secured every known access point to your location. No one knows you're here." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, but this time there was no weakness in them. Only rage, only betrayal carved into each tear like acid-etching glass. "Transfer complete," the operative said softly. "Swiss confirmation received. Targets are signing final documents." On the monitor, Daniel leaned back in his chair, a shark's smile curling across his lips. Emily smirked, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve with aristocratic disdain. Sarah's chest burned with the need to scream, but she forced herself to remain silent. She pressed her shaking fingers against her sternum as if holding herself together by sheer will alone. "Team Alpha, prepare for intercept," Agent Cole ordered into his mic, his voice low and controlled. "We take them when they exit the suite. Minimal exposure. Minimal collateral. Full asset seizure." Copy. Multiple voices confirmed in overlapping echoes. For a brief second, Daniel looked directly into the conference room camera. Sarah's breath caught. She knew he couldn't see her. Couldn't see the woman he'd betrayed watching him in real time as he secured his kingdom of blood money. But it felt like he did, like his gaze burned straight through the lenses, through walls and wires and encryption layers to find her. To remind her who held power all these years. A fresh tremor ran through her limbs, but she did not look away. Agent Cole placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, anchoring her to reality, to the cold tile beneath her feet and the stale hotel air in her lungs. "You're doing great," he said softly, his voice a deep, calm current cutting through the roaring chaos inside her mind. "Stay with me, Sarah. This is just the beginning." She turned to look up at him, tears shining in her dark eyes. But there was something else there now, something new, or perhaps something ancient that had only been buried under years of obedience and fear. "Resolve." She nodded, silent but unbroken, her gaze snapping back to the monitors. On the screen, Daniel closed his briefcase and rose to his feet. Emily stood beside him, looping her arm through his as they turned toward the exit. They looked like royalty leaving court, unaware that the headsman's axe waited just beyond the doors. Sarah pressed her lips together so tightly they went bloodless. In the hollow of her chest, where grief had burned a cavernous hole, a new flame began to glow, and it was not forgiveness. Night had fallen like a black shroud over the coastline, swallowing the marina in silence, broken only by the hush of the tide and the low rumble of distant engines. The moon hung half-hidden behind torn clouds, casting a cold silver glow over the line of yachts bobbing on dark water. Sarah stood in the tactical command van parked near Pier 17, its tinted windows reflecting the rows of armored SUVs lined up along the wharf. Inside the van, the air smelled of metal and electronics. Dozens of screens showed infrared footage, heat signatures moving like ghosts across grids of docks and rooftops. Agent Cole adjusted the earpiece coiled behind his neck, his eyes locked on the largest screen. A helicopter sat idling on the helipad at the far end of the pier, its rotors slowly turning, each blade cutting through mist with deadly precision. The strobing navigation lights blinked red and white in the darkness. Targets confirmed aboard helicopter. The lead sniper reported from an elevated vantage point atop an abandoned fish processing plant half a mile away. His voice was calm, almost bored. Visual on Daniel and Emily boarding with 3 armed bodyguards. Sarah felt her heart hammer so hard against her ribs she wondered if it might crack them open from the inside. On the screen, Daniel climbed into the helicopter cabin with the smooth, controlled movements of a man who believed himself untouchable. Even in the grainy infrared feed, his posture radiated arrogance. Emily followed close behind him, her platinum hair tied in a tight ponytail, her slim figure encased in a black tactical jumpsuit that gleamed under the cabin lights. "They're moving," Agent Cole said softly, though his voice carried the chill of steel. "Team Alpha intercept. Team Bravo take the south stairwell. Delta maintain perimeter lockdown." Sarah gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles whitening. Sweat prickled along her hairline despite the freezing air pumping from the ceiling vents. The command van vibrated faintly as the FBI tactical unit surged into action. Cameras switched views in rapid succession, agents in black combat gear fanning out across the docks. M4 rifles raised, night vision goggles glowing eerie green. "Bravo in position. Alpha ready. Delta locked. Go!" The word fell from Agent Cole's lips like a blade. On screen, the team surged forward in perfect silence, boots pounding across slick concrete. Their dark silhouettes blurred under the rotor's blast as they approached the helicopter from both flanks. Suddenly, the radio crackled with a burst of panicked static. "Contact! Contact! Rooftop sniper nest north side taking fire!" Muzzle flashes exploded in the darkness, sharp orange flares against the night. Bullets clanged off steel beams and sparked across asphalt. 2 tactical agents dove behind a concrete barrier, returning fire in controlled 3-round bursts. "Suppress and clear now," Agent Cole snapped. Sarah pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from crying out. Her entire body vibrated with the thunder of gunfire echoing through her chest. On the monitors, one of Daniel's bodyguards stepped out of the helicopter, an AR-15 braced against his shoulder. He fired in short, disciplined bursts, forcing the FBI team behind a fuel tanker. Another guard deployed a smoke grenade, plumes of dense white vapor billowing out, swallowing the pad in swirling ghost light. "Alpha breach the smoke flank left," Cole ordered. "Copy." 2 agents broke cover, sprinting low along the edge of the pier. Their infrared outlines merged with the swirling heat signature of the smoke moving like wraiths. One fired a tear gas canister toward the helicopter's open cabin door. The grenade clanged against the metal floor and erupted in a thick cloud of burning vapor. Targets are coughing. They're disoriented. Moving in, the camera zoomed in. Inside the helicopter, Daniel clutched his briefcase against his chest, his face twisted in fury. Emily bent double, hacking uncontrollably, her mascara streaked down her cheeks in black rivulets. "Get them out!" Daniel bellowed to his gods, his voice ragged with rage. "Get them out now!" Negative, Agent Cole growled. "Team Alpha, take the cabin." 3 agents in full tactical gear surged through the smoke rifles raised. The first threw Daniel against the seatback with brutal efficiency, wrenching the briefcase from his grip. Another slammed Emily to her knees, cuffing her wrists behind her back as she screamed. "You worthless cowards!" she shrieked, her voice shredding into hysteria. "Get off me, Sarah! I know you're watching this, you pathetic little rat. You think you've won? You think this is over?" Sarah felt the words pierce her like barbed hooks, but she did not flinch. She watched as the agents dragged Emily backward out of the helicopter, her long platinum ponytail whipping around her shoulders like a silver snake. On screen, Daniel roared in fury, straining against his captor's grip. The tactical agent rammed him face down onto the helipad, a knee grinding between his shoulder blades. He was yelling something Sarah could not hear over the static roar of the helicopter rotors, but she didn't need to hear it to know its meaning. Promises of revenge. Curses spat from a man who believed power could never abandon him. "Target secured, the comms channel reported. Helicopter clear. Area secured. No casualties. Repeat, no casualties." Agent Cole exhaled a single controlled breath and nodded once, the only sign of release he allowed himself. He turned to Sarah, his sharp hazel eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "It's over," he said quietly. Sarah felt her knees buckle. She grabbed the back of the chair for support, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. On the monitors, Daniel was being dragged across the pad in handcuffs, his hair disheveled, his tailored suit smeared with soot and tear gas residue. Emily followed behind him, screaming wordless curses into the night as two agents hauled her toward a waiting SUV. For a brief instant, as they passed under a floodlight, Emily looked straight into the nearby camera lens. Her eyes were wild, her mouth twisted into a snarl of animal fury. In that single second, Sarah saw her for what she truly was. Not a sister, not family, not blood. Only a predator who had worn her skin to get close enough to kill her. Sarah reached out and turned off the monitor. She did not need to see them again. Agent Cole placed his hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding real solid in a world that felt like it might dissolve beneath her feet at any moment. "You're safe now, Sarah," he said softly. "They can't hurt you anymore." Sarah closed her eyes, breathing in the sterile scent of metal plastic and burnt ozone. For the first time since this nightmare began, her chest loosened enough for her to take a full breath. But deep inside, where grief and rage twisted like twin vipers, she knew this was only the beginning. Justice had come tonight, carried on the boots of men with guns and badges. But retribution, that was something else entirely. And Sarah Whitmore was no longer the woman who forgave betrayal in silence. The interrogation room smelled of bleach and stale coffee. Its fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh white onto the metal table bolted to the concrete floor. Sarah sat on one side, her back straight, despite the exhaustion weighing down every part of her body. Across from her, Daniel slumped in his chair, wrists cuffed to a metal loop screwed into the tabletop. His tailored suit jacket was gone, leaving only his crisp white shirt now wrinkled and stained from the night's chaos. Dark circles pooled beneath his eyes, but there was no hint of defeat in his gaze, only simmering, poisonous hate. Agent Cole stood silently in the corner, arms crossed over his chest, observing without expression. The only sound in the room was the hum of the ventilation system and the distant echo of voices from the outer hallway. Daniel's eyes flicked up to meet Sarah's. For a moment he said nothing, only stared at her with a cruel, mocking smirk twisting his lips. Then he leaned forward, the steel cuffs clinking against the table's edge. "You think this changes anything?" He rasped, his voice low and venomous. "You think your little stunt tonight makes you strong?" Sarah's fingers tightened around the small velvet box resting in her lap. She didn't answer, didn't flinch under his gaze. The silence between them crackled like static electricity before a storm. Daniel laughed a harsh, humorless bark that bounced off the cinder-block walls. "You're pathetic," he sneered. "You've always been pathetic. That's why I chose you, Sarah. You were so easy. A quiet, pretty little librarian desperate to be loved. So eager to believe every lie I fed you." He leaned closer, lowering his voice until it became a snake's whisper slithering across the table. "You were nothing but a convenient cover. A naive doll to keep the bored investors happy, to keep the PR spotless. That's all you ever were to me, a toy." Sarah felt her pulse hammering in her throat, a hot, trembling rhythm that nearly drowned out his words. But not quite. Every syllable carved into her chest like a scalpel. She drew in a slow, steady breath, feeling the air burn her lungs before leaving her in a trembling exhale. Then she reached into her lap and lifted the sapphire ring from its box, holding it up between her fingers. Under the sterile lights, the gem blazed a deep ocean blue, its facets glittering like stars trapped beneath glass. Daniel's gaze flickered to the ring, then back to her eyes, confusion momentarily cracking through his mask of contempt. Sarah turned the ring slightly so the stone caught the light, perfectly illuminating the delicate gold filigree wrapped around its base. Her voice was calm, almost gentle as she spoke. "This isn't just a ring," she said softly. "It's the last gift my grandfather ever gave me." Daniel scoffed, rolling his eyes. What, you want me to cry over your senile old man's trinkets now? Sarah ignored him. She set the ring down on the table between them with deliberate care, the metal making a tiny ringing sound against the steel surface. She pushed it toward him until it sat directly in front of his cuffed hands. "It's not a trinket," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "It's the truth." Daniel frowned, leaning back slightly as if the sapphire burned his retinas. "What the hell are you talking about?" Sarah folded her hands in her lap, her posture regal despite the pain quivering through her shoulders. For a moment she saw herself reflected in the polished stone surface, a woman she barely recognized. Pale, exhausted eyes shadowed with grief and fury. But there was something else there too. "Steel, my grandfather knew exactly what kind of man you were," she said quietly. "He knew what you did to my father, what you planned for me. He hid this chip in his old ring knowing one day I'd find it, knowing it would show me everything." Daniel's face darkened, his lips curling back in a snarl. He lunged forward, the handcuffs yanking him short with a metallic clang. Veins bulged in his neck as his voice rose echoing through the room. "You think this is over?" he roared, spit flying from his mouth. "You think you've won, Sarah? You stupid, worthless girl. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Do you think the board will accept you now? Do you think the shareholders will let a pathetic little librarian take over a multi-billion-dollar empire? You're nothing without me. Nothing." Sarah didn't flinch. She watched him with cold, unwavering eyes, her breath calm, her body still. Slowly she reached out and pulled the ring back to her side of the table, closing her fingers around it like a secret kept safe. "You're wrong," she said, her voice quiet, but resonating with an iron strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I may be nothing to you, but to my grandfather, to the people you destroyed, to myself, I am everything you can never be." Daniel shook his head violently, his cuffed hands trembling against the table as he strained against the steel holding him down. His eyes burned with raw hatred, but beneath it, deep flickering at the edges, Sarah saw something else. Fear. She stood slowly pushing her chair back with a harsh scrape. She slipped the sapphire ring back into its box and snapped it shut, the soft click echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "Goodbye, Daniel," she whispered. As she turned to leave, he called after her, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. "You think you're safe now? You think you've won? This isn't over, Sarah. I will ruin you. I will ruin everything you ever loved. You're nothing. Do you hear me? You're nothing." But Sarah didn't turn back. She walked to the door, each step ringing with finality against the cold concrete floor. Agent Cole reached past her to open it, his broad frame shielding her as they stepped into the fluorescent-lit hallway beyond. Daniel's screams followed her, reverberating down the corridor like the rage of a dying king clinging to his crumbling throne with bloody fingers. Sarah paused just outside the room, her hand trembling slightly around the velvet box. Her heart ached, bruised and raw, but beneath the pain pulsed something fierce and unbreakable. Freedom. She looked up at Agent Cole, whose gaze met hers with quiet respect. "Let's finish this," she said softly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her voice did not tremble. The rain fell in steady sheets against the windows of the safe house. Outside, the world was a blur of city lights and wet asphalt neon signs flickering through the storm. But in Sarah's mind, she was no longer here. She closed her eyes, clutching the sapphire ring in her palm, and let memory pull her backward through the years beyond her own lifetime to a world she had only known through the hushed stories whispered by her grandfather. The Cold War era unfolded before her mind's eye, sharp and vivid. Berlin, 1963. The air was cold and laced with the iron scent of snow. A thin fog curled around the old stone buildings, muffling the low hum of military trucks crawling along cobblestone streets. In the shadows of an alley, A young man pressed his back against a damp brick wall, his breath clouding in front of him. He wore a tailored wool overcoat over a crisp charcoal suit, his hair dark and slicked back, his jaw clean-shaven. His eyes were sharp and unblinking as they watched the checkpoint across the street, where East German guards interrogated a trembling old woman with 2 suitcases. She clutched a rosary to her chest, tears streaking down her wrinkled cheeks. "Move along," a soldier barked, shoving her back into the line of refugees. The young man's lips pressed into a thin line. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the small velvet box hidden there. Inside, nestled in black satin, lay a sapphire ring. At first glance it looked like a family heirloom, a token of love perhaps, or a bribe for the corrupt officials who governed every crossing. But beneath the stone embedded with precision engineering lay something far more dangerous, a microchip no larger than a grain of rice. Contained within it, the blueprints for a classified Western propulsion system schematic codes for missile guidance algorithms, names of scientists defecting in secret. The culmination of 3 years of infiltration, bribery, seduction, and betrayal. His cover name here was Peter Stone, but to his real handlers across the Atlantic, he was Peter Whitmore, economic intelligence operative specializing in industrial secrets and asset extraction. Tonight was the final handoff before his exfiltration. He glanced at his watch, 23:08. The contact was late. He scanned the street again, his gaze slicing through fog and shadows. Then he saw her. A woman in a gray wool coat and felt hat stepped off the tram. Her posture was straight, movements brisk, but not hurried. Her gloved hand clutching a small leather purse. She walked past him without a glance, but as she passed, she murmured under her breath in perfect English, "Nice night for secrets, isn't it, Mr. Stone?" His pulse jumped. He pushed away from the wall and followed her around the corner into an alley that reeked of rotting produce. She didn't stop walking. Her heels clicked in a calm, measured rhythm until she reached the dead end. There she turned and faced him. "Do you have it?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the velvet box from his pocket and flipped it open, revealing the sapphire's deep blue depths. "Beautiful," she said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. She reached into her purse, withdrew a small jeweler's loop, and inspected the stone. A thin smile touched her lips. Clever. Even if customs scanned it, they'd only see a decorative metal base. "Who designed the housing?" Langley, he said curtly. She nodded, then tucked the box into her purse and snapped it shut. "You're clear for exfiltration tomorrow night. Soviet counterintelligence is tightening net across checkpoint Charlie. You'll take Friedrichstrasse to Kochstrasse, then east to Glinkastrasse. New documents, funds, and extraction details will be delivered to your hotel room by dawn." He didn't move. His gaze was fixed on her pale, elegant face, noting every line, every shadow. Finally, his voice softened. "Do you ever think about what we're doing?" he asked. "The lives destroyed by these secrets. The families torn apart." She tilted her head slightly, regarding him with cold, intelligent eyes. "We are soldiers, Peter. Information is our battlefield. Our weapons are words, codes, blueprints. The collateral damage is unavoidable." He exhaled slowly, white mist curling from his lips into the frozen night. Still, he murmured almost to himself, "I hope someday it will be worth it." She said nothing. She only turned and walked away, her heels fading into silence. That night, Peter Whitmore lay awake in his small rented room overlooking the Berlin Wall. He held the sapphire ring in his palm, feeling its cool weight press against his skin. He thought of the woman in the alley, of the old refugee at the checkpoint, of the scientists whose names were encrypted in that tiny chip. He thought of the future, a future he might never see, children he might never hold, a granddaughter he might never meet. But deep in his chest, beneath the burden of secrets and guilt, a fierce hope burned. The hope that if he survived this, if he made it home, he could build a life free of shadows. And if he ever had a granddaughter, he would teach her everything he knew about the world, about betrayal and loyalty, about deception and truth, about standing tall when life sought to grind her down. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "One day, little girl, if life ever breaks you, I hope you'll find the strength to rise again." Years later, sitting in the quiet of his workshop back in Connecticut, he would embed that same sapphire with a new chip. A recording of voices plotting murder and theft, proof of crimes hidden behind boardroom smiles and champagne toasts. He polished the stone with a soft cloth, his old hands trembling slightly. Outside the window, autumn leaves burned red and gold under a pale sun. His granddaughter played on the porch, her small voice floating on the breeze as she read stories to her dolls. Peter watched her through the glass, his chest tightening with quiet love. "Sarah," he murmured softly, running his thumb over the sapphire one day, "this world will try to break you. When that day comes, I won't be here to protect you. But you'll have this. And maybe, just maybe, it will help you stand up when they try to keep you down." He placed the ring in its carved wooden box, folded the letter, and slid it beneath the velvet lining. Then he closed the lid and set it on the highest shelf of his workshop, where the evening light struck its polished surface like a silent promise. Back in the safe house, Sarah opened her eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she cradled the ring against her chest, feeling its familiar weight anchor her trembling heart. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered into the quiet room, her voice breaking with grief and gratitude. "I will stand up. I promise." Outside, dawn was breaking through the storm clouds, streaks of gold and rose flooding the world with light. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt strong enough to face it. The morning news exploded like a grenade across every screen in New York City. Televisions in cafes, airports, and living rooms flashed the same bold headlines scrolling urgently beneath the stern faces of news anchors. "Billion-dollar industrial scandal. CEO Daniel Miller and sister-in-law Emily Thompson arrested for attempted murder and corporate embezzlement." The footage rolled on loop, Daniel in handcuffs, head bowed but eyes burning with undisguised hatred as officers shoved him into the back of an armored SUV. Emily, her designer coat slipping off one shoulder, hair tangled and mascara streaked, screamed curses at the cameras while agents restrained her. Reporters crowded outside the FBI headquarters, microphones raised like weapons, their voices sharp with indignation. Sources confirm Daniel Miller is charged with conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and laundering upwards of $50 million into offshore accounts in Switzerland. Emily Thompson, once praised for her philanthropic work, now faces identical charges after wiretap evidence revealed her involvement in the attempted poisoning of her own father. As the word spilled out across news channels and social media feeds, the world reacted with horror. Corporate boardrooms erupted into chaos. Executives who had built their careers on Daniel's shadowed promises now found themselves targeted by federal subpoenas. Lawyers scrambled to assemble emergency defense teams. Phones rang off the hook with frantic investors demanding answers. But there were no answers, only devastation. On Wall Street, the company's stock plummeted within hours of market opening. Red arrows bled down screens as traders shouted orders into headsets. Billionaire investors watched their portfolios collapse, their carefully diversified assets dragged under by a scandal no PR team could spin. Within 3 days, shares lost over 82% of their value. Within a week, bankruptcy proceedings began. Within 2 weeks, the company's name was synonymous with moral rot, its once pristine brand forever tainted by the revelation of attempted patricide for inheritance. In the industrial districts outside New Jersey, factory gates clanged shut. Metal locks rattled as workers gathered in crowds clutching cardboard boxes filled with personal belongings. The morning air was cold and heavy with silence. Men and women who had dedicated 30 years to the assembly lines stood in stunned disbelief. "This can't be happening," a forklift operator, whispered to her colleague, tears brimming in her eyes. My husband's been sick. We were counting on the insurance. It's gone, he replied hoarsely. Everything's gone. Children waited outside daycare centers for parents who didn't arrive on time, their teachers checking watches anxiously. Mortgage payments went unpaid. Grocery bills stacked up. Gas tanks stayed half empty. Families who once had stability now faced eviction notices stapled to peeling door frames. At a diner on 7th Avenue, the television above the counter played the footage on loop. Patrons sat in silence, coffee cups cooling in their hands as Daniel's mugshot glared back at them full of arrogance and defiance. He poisoned his own father for money, one waitress whispered to her co-worker, her voice shaking with disgust. And all these years we thought he was this genius CEO. He's just a monster. In upscale Manhattan boardrooms, HR managers read off layoff notices, their voices robotic as they repeated the same script 100 times before lunch. I'm sorry. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately. You will receive 2 weeks of severance and instructions regarding COBRA insurance in your termination packet. In the back rows of each meeting, older employees sat with slumped shoulders, clutching manila folders and trembling hands, wondering what they would tell their families after decades of loyalty ended in a 2-minute conversation. On the front pages of national newspapers, Daniel's story eclipsed wars, elections, and economic reports. Op-eds ran with headlines like, When Greed Becomes Murder, The Fall of Daniel Miller, How Corporate Corruption Destroys Families and Nations Alike. Talk shows invited psychologists, former FBI agents, and business ethics professors to dissect every dark detail. It's a classic profile of malignant narcissism, one psychologist said. Daniel Miller saw people not as human beings, but as tools to be used for his own gain, including his wife Sarah, whom he discarded like trash when she no longer served his purpose. Meanwhile, on social media, hashtags trended worldwide: Justice for Sarah, Shard Corporate Murder, Daniel Miller Scandal, Empires of Blood. People posted furious rants about corporate greed, betrayal, and toxic power. They dug up old clips of Daniel giving interviews about family values and loyalty as the foundation of business, overlaying his smiling face with captions of the charges he now faced. In her safe house room, Sarah watched it all unfold on a muted television. The words scrolled across the screen, endless and damning. Photos of Daniel, photos of Emily, photos of their mugshots side by side, a portrait of betrayal so complete it felt almost biblical. Her hands trembled around a chipped ceramic mug filled with chamomile tea. The liquid rippled as she tried to keep herself steady. She could hear Agent Cole's voice from the other room, low and firm as he coordinated next steps with federal prosecutors. Full cooperation from Sarah Thompson is secured, he said. She's the reason we broke this open. The reason. She closed her eyes and let the words settle over her like a blanket. Heavy, scratchy, but warm in their own way. Outside, the city moved on. Cars honked, subway brakes screamed on metal rails. Rain drizzled on glass skyscrapers reflecting the rising sun. But inside, a storm far greater than rain or wind raged through every sector of society. Thousands of employees without jobs. Entire supply chains collapsing overnight. Pension funds frozen. Health benefits revoked. And at the center of it all, a single man and woman who chose greed over blood, betrayal over love. For a brief moment, Sarah felt the crushing weight of guilt press down on her chest. So many lives destroyed. So many families devastated because she had been blind to Daniel's true nature for so long. But then she remembered her grandfather's words echoing through the ache. Stand up when they push you down. She hadn't caused this destruction. They had. She had simply ripped away the mask, exposed the rot hiding beneath the marble floors and mahogany boardroom tables. The cost was unimaginable, yes, but the cost of silence would have been greater. She opened her eyes and saw her reflection in the darkened television screen. Her hair was unbrushed. Her eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights, but there was steel in her gaze, a quiet, unbreakable resolve. The news continued without pause, feeding society's hunger for justice. FBI confirms all offshore accounts frozen. Daniel Miller and Emily Thompson held without bail pending federal charges of attempted murder, corporate fraud, and conspiracy. They face life sentences if convicted. Sarah set down her mug, rose from the worn, upholstered chair, and walked to the window. Beyond the rain-slicked glass lay a city rebuilding itself hour by hour, traffic inching through streets littered with fallen leaves and early morning mist. She pressed her fingers against the cool pane, feeling the faint vibration of sirens wailing somewhere in the distance. Justice was not gentle, she thought. It did not come without pain. It burned, it broke, it ripped apart lives and illusions. But like wildfire clearing dead brush, it made space for something new to grow. Her grandfather had known that truth. Now she did too. And as she turned away from the window, the sapphire ring glinting blue in her palm, Sarah Thompson knew with unshakable certainty that this was only the beginning. The courtroom lights dimmed behind her as Sarah stepped through the tall oak doors into the cool evening air. The sky outside was painted in streaks of deep rose and orange clouds glowing like embers fading into dusk. For a moment she stood on the wide marble steps, her hands trembling around the strap of her leather bag. Camera flashes still flickered in the distance, reporters shouting her name with the shrill desperation of vultures sensing blood. But she didn't look at them. She didn't hear them. Their voices melted into the city's twilight hum as she descended each step with measured grace. 1 foot in front of the other, she told herself. Always forward, never back. When her shoes finally touched the sidewalk, Agent Cole approached from the shadows near the security barricade. His tie was loosened, his posture tired but resolute. "You did good today, Sarah," he said softly, his voice nearly drowned by the sirens echoing down the avenue. "Really good." She looked up at him, the lined creases around his eyes catching the fading light. There was a softness in his expression that reminded her of her grandfather's tired smile after long days in the workshop. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once. "Where will you go now?" She glanced over her shoulder at the looming courthouse. Its stone columns bathed in the gold glow of sodium lamps, a place of law and justice, but also of pain and exposure. Then she turned back to him, her eyes calm. "I need to see him," she said. "I need to tell him that I kept my promise." He didn't ask who him was. He simply placed a protective hand on her shoulder, guiding her to the waiting black sedan idling at the curb. The driver held the door open, his cap pulled low against the gathering night chill. She slid into the back seat, folding her trembling hands in her lap as the engine rumbled to life. The car pulled away from the courthouse and merged into traffic weaving through the city that glowed with life even as it carried so much hidden death. They passed shuttered storefronts, flickering neon signs, street vendors closing for the day. As the city fell away behind them, the roads turned quieter, lined with towering pine trees swaying in the dusk breeze. The drive took nearly an hour. During that time, Sarah pressed her forehead against the window, watching telephone wires dip and rise, their dark silhouettes slicing across the fading lavender sky. Memories rose unbidden, thick and suffocating. Daniel's smirk, Emily's triumphant hiss, the sharp scent of betrayal metallic and cold in her throat. But beneath those memories pulsed an older, deeper current. Another voice, another presence. "Never bend your head, little starling. Always hold it high. When they push you down, stand up taller." Tears welled in her eyes as the words wrapped around her like a woolen shawl against the chill. She clenched her fists in her lap, feeling the sapphire ring bite into her palm, the ridges of its setting pressed into her skin, grounding her. Finally, the car turned onto a quiet gravel road flanked by iron fences lined with moss. The driver slowed, pulling to a gentle stop before tall wrought iron gates. Beyond them lay rolling hills dotted with marble headstones and old Celtic crosses, their shadows stretching long in the orange wash of sunset. She stepped out onto the gravel, her heels crunching softly with each step as she walked through the gates. The cold breeze rushed past her, carrying with it the crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth. Above, crows wheeled in dark spirals, their cries lonely against the quiet whisper of wind in the trees. Sarah walked along the winding path, her eyes scanning rows of stone, until she saw it a modest granite headstone beneath an ancient pine. The branches above it swayed their needles, catching the last golden light of day, shimmering like tiny green knives against the dying sky. She approached slowly, her breath ragged in her chest. "Hi, Grandpa," she whispered. Her voice cracked as she knelt in the soft grass, ignoring the way dampness seeped through her skirt to her knees. Carefully, with trembling fingers, she set down the bouquet she had brought. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple blue ribbon. Inside, nestled among white lilies and pale roses, were sprigs of blue delphiniums, his favorite. Her fingers traced the letters carved into the stone. Peter Whitmore, 1925, 2008. Beloved father, cherished grandfather, keeper of secrets. She let out a choked laugh at the last line. Her uncle had insisted on it for the epitaph, never knowing how deeply true it was. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed her forehead against the cold granite. "I did it," she whispered. "I finally did it." I stood up when they tried to break me. Wind sighed through the pine branches above rustling needles like distant applause. The sunset cast long shadows across the graves, the golden light catching in her hair and illuminating her tear-streaked face with warmth. "I know you probably wanted a different life for me," she said, her voice steadier now. "A quiet life. Children. Safety. Happiness. I wanted that too." She paused, swallowing the knot in her throat. "But they took it away from me. They took everything away. And for a long time, I thought that meant I was nothing, that without them I had no worth." She closed her eyes, the sapphire ring pressed against the stone as she clutched it to her chest. "But you were right, Grandpa. Worth doesn't come from what people give you. It comes from what you refuse to let them take. And they couldn't take this." She sat there in silence for a long time, listening to the hush of evening settling over the cemetery. The crows had gone quiet. Crickets began to chirp in the tall grass. The scent of pine deepened as the last sliver of sun sank behind the hills, leaving only a bruised purple sky overhead. Finally, she stood brushing dirt and grass from her knees. Her legs trembled as she stepped back from the grave. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and let out a long, shaky breath. "I love you," she whispered into the stillness. "Thank you for everything." She turned away, the ring glinting blue in her hand, and walked back down the winding path toward the waiting car. The breeze lifted her hair, carrying with it the scent of pine and dusk and freedom. As she stepped through the iron gates back onto the gravel road, she felt lighter. She felt whole. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place she could stand in, a place she could shape with her own two hands. Behind her, the wind stirred through the pines, whispering a benediction into the falling night, and Sarah Thompson, once broken, now unbreakable, walked forward into the gathering dark, with her head held high. Sarah pulled off the narrow country road and onto the gravel driveway leading up to the old wooden cabin. Morning mist clung to the earth like a sleeping child clings to its mother. Dew sparkled along the rusted mailbox that still bore her grandfather's name carved into its side. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing in the silence. Birds sang among the pines, their voices drifting through the cracked window. A chipmunk darted across the moss-lined porch steps, pausing to sniff the air before vanishing beneath the rotting boards. 5 months had passed since the trial. 5 months since Daniel and Emily's conviction. 5 months since Sarah Thompson reclaimed her life from the ashes of betrayal. During those months, she sold the penthouse Daniel once bought with her family's money. She liquidated her shares in the company, refusing every board seat offered to her as an empty apology. She let go of her lawyers, her accountants, her stylists, her press agents. One by one, she stripped away the people who had latched onto her name like barnacles to a drowning ship. And she returned here, this cabin, this land, this place of memory and pain and healing. Stepping out of the car, she inhaled the cold morning air deep into her lungs. Her boots crunched on frost-hardened grass as she walked toward the porch. It sagged under her weight, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and touched the peeling white paint on the railing, feeling the splinters prick her fingers. For weeks she had worked alongside the builders, refusing to stay in hotels or luxury rentals. She slept on a cot by the stone fireplace, while the crew replaced rotting beams and rewired the entire structure. She painted walls, scrubbed floors, reshingled the roof with her own hands, her muscles burning each night with honest exhaustion. And now at last it was finished. A woman stood waiting on the porch. Tall, dark-skinned, wearing navy leggings and a fitted athletic jacket. Her eyes were calm and steady, her arms corded with lean muscle. "Morning, Sarah," she said with a smile. "Class is setting up inside." "Thank you, Renee," Sarah replied softly, nodding in gratitude. She stepped past Renee and pushed open the door. Warm air rushed to greet her, carrying the scent of sage and cedarwood. The old living room was gone. In its place stood wide mats rolled out across polished wooden floors. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, falling on the circle of women gathered near the fireplace. Some wore yoga pants and hoodies. Others wore jeans and t-shirts. All of them had eyes that looked tired but determined. Eyes that carried bruises, some visible, most hidden. Sarah set her bag down by the door and walked barefoot across the mats, feeling the smooth grain of the boards beneath her toes. "Good morning," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "Good morning," they chorused back, some smiling shyly, others clutching mugs of herbal tea to their chests like talismans. She sat down cross-legged before them, the sapphire ring on her finger catching the morning light and casting blue sparks across the ceiling beams. For a moment she stared at the ring, feeling its weight, remembering the secrets it carried, remembering the man who gave it to her not just as protection, but as a torch to light her own path. This place. She began, her eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the freshly oiled wood, the linen cushions, the stacks of donated blankets, the shelves lined with trauma psychology books and self-defense manuals. This place used to belong to my grandfather. She paused, letting the silence settle around her words like falling snow. He was a man who taught me what real strength looked like. Not the kind that breaks people down, but the kind that builds them up. The kind that stays silent and steady when the world tries to drown you in its noise. A woman with short red hair shifted where she sat, tears brimming in her eyes. "I created this center," Sarah continued, "because I believe every woman here is capable of finding that kind of strength within herself. Not just to survive, but to live. To stand up when you've been pushed down. To trust yourself when everyone calls you crazy. To see the signs. And to walk away before betrayal turns to destruction." Renee stepped forward, holding out a thick, leather-bound workbook. Sarah took it and flipped it open to the first page, revealing a handwritten inscription: "For every woman who ever believed love required her silence. St." She set the book down on the floor between them. This week she set her gaze moving from one woman to the next. "We'll begin with 2 things. First, psychological literacy. learning how manipulation works, what it sounds like, what it feels like. Second, self-defense. The basic moves you can use to protect yourself if you're ever trapped, cornered, or grabbed. She turned to Renee with a nod. Today's session, Renee said, her voice calm and clear, will be about awareness drills and verbal assertiveness. Next week we'll begin Krav Maga basics. A quiet murmur of anticipation rippled through the women. Sarah smiled. I know it can feel overwhelming. I know it feels impossible sometimes to imagine yourself fighting back. But trust me, it isn't. It just takes one decision. She held up her hand, fingers curled into a fist. One decision she repeated: to never let anyone write your story for you again. The room fell silent. Outside, the wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and wildflowers. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a woodpecker tapped out its patient rhythm against the bark of a tall cedar. Sarah rose to her feet, brushing off her leggings. Her muscles ached with the dull throb of a body that had spent weeks working without pause. But beneath the ache pulsed a deeper strength, a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in years. Let's begin, she said softly. She led them through breathing exercises, each inhale filling their lungs with pine-scented air, each exhale releasing the tight knots of fear wound deep inside their chests. They practiced grounding stances, learning how to root their bodies into the floor like oaks against a storm. And as they moved together, the sun climbed higher into the sky, spilling gold light through the wide windows, warming their faces and casting long, unbroken shadows across the gleaming wooden floor. Later, during their lunch break, Sarah stepped outside onto the porch, sipping green tea from a clay mug. She looked out across the clearing where her grandfather's old garden once bloomed. Now rows of lavender and rosemary waved gently in the breeze, their fragrance carried to her on the wind. I did it, Grandpa, she thought, her chest tightening with gratitude and ache. I built something better out of the ruins. Behind her, laughter rang out as Renee showed the women how to break out of wrist grabs using leverage rather than strength. The sound of it, unguarded, genuine, alive, filled Sarah's heart with a peace deeper than silence. For the first time in years, she no longer felt haunted. She felt reborn. And as she turned back toward the cabin, her home, her sanctuary, the morning sun caught the sapphire on her finger, sending blue light scattering like shattered sky across the porch. She raised her hand, letting the light dance over her face, and smiled. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a teacher, a healer, a warrior. And in that quiet moment of pine-scented dawn, Sarah Thompson knew she would never again be broken. The sun was just beginning its descent, casting long golden rays across the city skyline as Sarah stepped out onto the rooftop terrace of the Thompson Industries headquarters. The glass door clicked shut behind her, silencing the quiet hum of the elevator lobby. She walked slowly toward the edge, her heels clicking against the marble tiles. The summer breeze lifted strands of her hair, whipping them gently around her face. She didn't bother taming them. She welcomed the feeling. The wind smelled faintly of concrete dust and blooming magnolias from the rooftop gardens 3 buildings over. Below, the city pulsed with life. Yellow cabs weaved between black sedans and buses. Pedestrians moved like shifting rivers along the sidewalks. Office lights flickered on one by one as dusk claimed the glass towers. And there, nestled among them, stood the building that once housed her family's empire, the empire Daniel had tried to steal. She inhaled deeply, letting the air fill her lungs, letting its coolness settle her racing thoughts. She wore a simple white blouse tucked into navy-tailored slacks, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows. The sapphire ring gleamed on her left hand, catching the waning sun and throwing fractured blue light across the balcony railing. This is where it ends, she thought. Or maybe where it finally begins. Behind her, through the tinted windows, She could see the new board members moving about the conference room. Men and women in dark suits, some whispering urgently to each other, others typing rapid notes into tablets. They had begged her to stay for the full press conference, to speak, to stand as the figurehead of moral redemption after the company's public disgrace. But she had declined. She didn't want applause for surviving. She didn't need their polished words about bravery, resilience, or feminine strength. What she needed was this: a moment alone to look out over the city her grandfather helped build, the city Daniel tried to claim with poison and lies. A moment to feel the wind, the sunlight, the quiet truth of who she had become. She walked to the edge and rested her hands lightly on the metal railing. Far below, a taxi horn blared, echoing off glass facades. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the tinted windows behind her, a woman outlined in blue light hair, wind-tossed eyes calm and steady. She thought of Daniel in his prison cell, stripped of tailored suits and diamond cufflinks, pacing like a caged predator. Of Emily in her orange jumpsuit, staring blankly at the concrete floor, her once lovely hair hacked to shoulder length. The media had feasted on their downfall. The husband who betrayed for greed, the sister who betrayed for power. And through it all they called Sarah the victim who rose. But she didn't feel like a victim. Not anymore. She felt free. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, jolting her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw Agent Cole's name flash on the screen. She smiled faintly, imagining him back at the bureau, probably standing by his desk. Tie-loosened coffee mug half full, watching the evening news scroll updates about the Thompson Industries fraud case. She didn't answer. There would be time later to thank him again. For now, she needed silence. She turned the sapphire ring slowly on her finger, feeling its cool metal against her skin. Memories rose like mist. Her grandfather's workbench bathed in warm lamplight, the smell of cedar shavings and engine oil. His steady hands as he set the stone into its wrought silver band. His quiet voice whispering, "Stand up when you've been knocked down. And if you can't stand up, crawl forward, but never stay down." The ache in her chest softened into something warm and bittersweet. She closed her eyes, letting his words settle into the marrow of her bones. The sun dipped lower, slipping behind the high-rises, painting the clouds in shades of lavender and burnt gold. The wind picked up, ruffling her blouse, tugging playfully at the sapphire's glinting light. She opened her eyes and looked out over the city with a quiet fierceness. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need them to suffer in order to heal. She needed only this, to live her truth, to walk her path, to remember that her worth was never measured in the loyalty of traitors, nor in the power of those who tried to break her. She raised her hand, letting the dying light dance across the sapphire, refracting brilliant shards of blue into the darkening sky. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but unbreakable, words carried away by the evening breeze. "I don't need revenge," she said, her eyes steady on the horizon where the first evening stars blinked to life. "Because justice already did what it needed to do. I just need to live, true to my own worth." A tear slid down her cheek, not of sadness, but of something deeper, a release, a letting go. She brushed it away with the back of her hand and allowed herself a small smile. Behind her, the tinted windows reflected the silhouette of a woman standing tall against the setting sun. The woman she was always meant to become. The sound of footsteps approached. Renee stepped out onto the terrace wearing jeans and a cropped workout jacket, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. "Everyone's waiting downstairs," Renee said gently. "The board wants to finalize the transitional funding for the Women's Center. I'll be there in a moment," Sarah replied, her eyes still on the city skyline. "I just needed this." Renee smiled, softly understanding. She reached out and rested a warm hand on Sarah's shoulder. "They're lucky to have you," she said. "We all are." Sarah turned her head slightly, meeting Renee's gaze with quiet gratitude. "No," she whispered. I'm lucky to finally have myself. The two women stood there in silence for a moment, watching the last rays of sun slip below the city horizon, the sapphire's light fading into twilight. Finally, Sarah turned and walked back toward the glass doors, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. As she reached for the handle, she glanced back once more at the fading city, her sapphire catching the dim light glinting with the last fragments of day. And she smiled. Fade out. A low, inspiring piano melody rose in the background, merging with a swelling orchestral harmony as the screen faded to black. Soft white letters appeared. I don't need revenge, because justice did what it needed to do. I just need to live true to my own worth. The music grew lifting into a luminous chorus of strings and piano. Fade out. Produced by your channel brand. Written by your screenwriting team. Directed by director name. End credit scroll. The last frame lingered on the shimmering sapphire ring, its deep blue heart beating with a silent, unbreakable truth. Then the music faded, leaving only quiet and hope.